Mark Sullivan's hands trembled around his coffee mug in the small Chicago diner where Emma had been serving for 3 years. 42 years old, $800 million fortune, owner of a luxury hotel chain across America. Yet he looked as fragile as cracked glass. The doctors at Northwestern Memorial had given him 1 week to live. Inoperable brain tumor. No appeals left. He looked at the waitress who had smiled at him every morning for 6 months. This young woman from South Side who knew nothing about his wealth and made the most insane proposal of his life. 7 days, 7 cities, one last journey across America before the curtain fell. Emma Rodriguez's brown eyes widened in disbelief as the coffee pot shook in her hands. They barely knew each other, yet this absurd request would transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Chicago awakened under the pale October sun when Mark Sullivan pushed open the door of Mel's Diner on North Clark Street. It was 7:30 sharp, as it had been every morning for 6 months. The bell above the door chimed with that familiar sound that announced another seemingly identical day. Lincoln Park was stirring with its usual mix of joggers and dog walkers, far from the Loop's corporate chaos, but close enough to feel the city's pulse. Mel's Diner occupied a corner that had resisted the neighborhood's gentrification, maintaining its authentic Chicago character. Cracked vinyl booths, a bun coffee maker from the 80s, and walls covered with faded photos of the owner Mel with Bears players from the '85 Super Bowl team. Mark Sullivan stood out in this nostalgic setting. At 42, he embodied modern American success, personal wealth of $800 million, a chain of luxury hotels stretching from Manhattan to Malibu, a penthouse on Michigan Avenue, a yacht moored in Miami. Yet every morning, he entered this modest diner as if it were the only place in the world where he could breathe. His story was one that Fortune and the Wall Street Journal loved to tell. Born in Gary, Indiana, in the shadow of abandoned steel mills, son of a small motel owner who ran a shabby place near the interstate. When Mark was 16, his father hanged himself in the motel's storage room, crushed by debt and shame of impending bankruptcy. His mother, already fragile, died 6 months later in a South Bend psychiatric facility, consumed by grief. Mark had rebuilt everything with a determination that frightened even his business partners. He'd slept for months in the closed motel's lobby, studying business from library books during the day, crafting business plans by candlelight at night when the electricity was cut. At 19, he'd convinced a shady Chicago investor to loan him enough to buy back his father's motel. By 23, he'd paid everything back and owned 3 properties. At 30, he was on the cover of Forbes. At 40, he controlled an empire. But success had a price no Swiss account could pay. Mark had no family, no real friends. His relationships were transactions, his affairs unspoken contracts. He'd had beautiful women, models and actresses who posted selfies from his penthouse, but none who'd seen him cry or truly laugh. He was surrounded, yet profoundly, desperately alone. Emma Rodriguez represented the antithesis of all this. 28 years of authentic life, no Instagram filters needed. Born and raised in Pilsen, Chicago's Mexican neighborhood, daughter of immigrants who'd crossed the border in the 90s. Her father, Miguel, worked construction, often without papers. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned offices downtown, working nights to make ends meet. Emma had grown between 2 worlds, the cramped apartment in Pilsen, where Spanish and Spanglish ruled, and the University of Chicago, where she'd earned a scholarship. She devoured Hemingway and Garcia Marquez with equal passion, wrote short stories that blended Steinbeck's realism with Isabel Allende's magic. She'd graduated magna cum laude with a degree in comparative literature, her thesis on Chicago immigrant narratives impressing her advisor. She dreamed of writing, of building bridges between cultures, of telling the invisible stories of her generation. But Chicago's reality was harsh. Student loans to repay, younger brother Carlos to help through community college, parents aging in their third-floor walk-up with no elevator. The MFA program was a luxury she couldn't afford. She'd landed behind the counter at Mel's Diner, serving coffee to lawyers who never saw her. Yet, Emma wasn't bitter. She had that particular light of people who transform the ordinary into extraordinary. She remembered every regular's coffee preference, slipped an extra pancake to the homeless vet who came in Tuesdays, listened to Northwestern students' heartbreaks like they were Shakespearean tragedies. Mark had discovered the diner by accident 6 months earlier. His driver was stuck on Lake Shore Drive. He had an important meeting in Lincoln Park. He'd entered for quick coffee and was stunned by Emma's smile, a smile that calculated nothing, that didn't know who he was. For the first time in years, someone saw him as just Mark, not the Mark Sullivan of business magazines. He'd returned the next day, then the next. It became his secret ritual, his parenthesis in days packed with Tokyo calls and dinners at the Chicago Club. For half an hour each morning, sitting in this diner that smelled of strong coffee and bacon grease, he could pretend to be normal. They'd never really talked beyond pleasantries, but Mark had memorized every detail of Emma. How she bit her pen when taking orders, the sparkle in her eyes when kids entered, the snippets of Selena songs she hummed while wiping tables. And Emma had noticed more than she'd admit, the loneliness behind the Florida tan, the hands that trembled slightly after too many sleepless nights, the gray eyes searching for something unfindable. The headaches had started 6 months ago, precisely when he'd begun frequenting the diner. First ignored, then fought with ibuprofen, finally examined by Chicago's best neurologist. The MRI revealed the intruder, glioblastoma multiforme, stage IV, inoperable position. The experts at Northwestern, Mayo Clinic, even Johns Hopkins consulted via video, rendered the same verdict, 1 to 2 weeks maximum. Mark had received the final diagnosis a week ago, in a Lake Forest clinic that looked like a 5-star hotel. The doctor, with his cultivated North Shore accent, had laid out options. Palliative chemo that might add 3 days of agony. Radiation that would temporarily ease symptoms. Mark refused everything. If he was dying, it would be standing, not as a patient. The following days were an administrative tornado. Will rewritten 3 times at his LaSalle Street lawyer's office. Foundations created. Succession organized. He'd said his masked goodbyes, a prolonged handshake with his COO, a Hermes scarf for his assistant, an anonymous check to the Southside Food Bank where he'd eaten as a teenager. But while organizing his death, an obsession haunted him. He was leaving this world without really seeing it. He'd conquered business, but never seen the Northern Lights, never stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon, never heard jazz on Bourbon Street. He'd lived in a bubble of first-class lounges and Four Seasons suites, never touching real life. That October morning, he entered the diner with his decision made, but without the courage to execute it. Instead of sitting at the counter as usual, he chose a booth by the window. Emma approached with her usual smile, but immediately noticed something was off. Maybe it was the pallor beneath the artificial tan. Maybe the hands trembling more than usual. Maybe the gaze already seeing beyond. When she set down the coffee, black, no sugar, as always, Mark really looked at her for the first time. Not as the morning waitress, but as Emma, a young woman with a story, dreams, fears. He saw intelligence behind the apron, strength behind professional kindness, depth beneath the polished surface. The words came out before he could stop them. He told her about the cancer with the clinical detachment of a PowerPoint presentation. Glioblastoma multiforme, 1 week life expectancy, 2 if lucky. He saw shock cross Emma's face, the coffee pot wavering imperceptibly. Then came the hardest part, the trip he'd planned this past week. 7 days, 7 cities. New York for one last look at Manhattan, Nashville for the music he'd never listened to, New Orleans for the life he'd never tasted. Santa Fe for the desert silence, San Francisco for the Pacific sunset, Seattle for the rain he'd always avoided, and back to Chicago to die where he'd truly lived, in the empire he'd built. But the real madness was yet to come. Mark explained he didn't want to travel alone. No private nurse, no devoted assistant. He wanted someone authentic, someone who didn't know him as the magnate Sullivan, but simply as Mark. Emma listened, the diner around them seeming to fade. When Mark finished, she asked the obvious question. Why her? They were strangers, barely acquaintances. Mark thought for a long moment. He told her the truth. In 6 months of morning coffees, she was the only person he'd met who wanted nothing from him. She didn't know about his fortune, didn't treat him with the calculated deference of those who knew his net worth. She was the only one who saw him as a human being, not a walking portfolio. The financial offer defied logic. First-class travel and 5-star hotels paid, plus $50,000 cash. For Emma, it meant freedom from debt, security for her family, the chance to finally write without the anxiety of rent. In exchange, just company. No romantic obligations. She could leave whenever she wanted. Everything would be notarized. Emma felt the weight of this surreal decision. Her parents had sacrificed everything for her education. What would they say if she left with a stranger, even a rich and dying one? And her job? And the madness of traveling with a man who could die anywhere?
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
But there was something in Mark's gray eyes that transcended a dying man's panic. A thirst for life, a need for connection that echoed something in her. She too, in a way, was dying, suffocated by routine, dreams deferred, life unlived. She asked for 24 hours to decide. Mark nodded, stood up, left a $50 bill for $3 coffee. Before leaving, he turned and said the flight to New York left from O'Hare tomorrow, 2:30 p.m., Terminal 1, Gate B6. He'd wait for her. If she didn't come, he'd understand and go alone. He left, leaving Emma sitting in that booth, Mark's untouched coffee cooling slowly before her, while the world around resumed its course as if nothing had happened. But for Emma, everything had changed. A man had just asked her to witness his death across America, and strangely, madly, part of her wanted to say yes. Emma spent the next 24 hours in feverish turmoil. That evening, in the Pilsen apartment where the radiator clanked all night, she told everything over her mother's homemade tamales. The food cooled on plates as she talked. She expected outrage, prohibitions, drama. But her father, Miguel, hands marked by 20 years of construction work, simply said that sometimes God opens strange doors that lead to destiny. He told how he'd left Michoacan with just a backpack, trusting a coyote he'd never met. That crazy decision had led to their family, their life, everything they'd built. Her mother Rosa held her, whispering bendiciones. Carlos, studying accounting at community college, Googled Mark Sullivan, confirming the man was real, respected, scandal-free. Articles in the Tribune, interviews in Crane's Chicago Business, photos of hotel openings. Everything checked out. Emma spent the night on the fire escape overlooking the Chicago skyline, smoking cigarettes she'd quit years ago, writing in the notebook she kept for stories never started. She wrote about dreams buried under 3 years of coffee coming right up, and that'll be 12:50. The next morning, Mel, the diner's owner and Vietnam vet, who'd seen everything, immediately noticed her agitation. When she told him the story, he scratched his bald head and surprised her. He talked about his wife Joyce, dead from lung cancer 5 years ago. He'd give anything for one last week traveling with her instead of those months in the hospital smelling of bleach and despair. The job would always be there. Chances to really live were rare. At O'Hare, Mark waited at Gate B6 with 2 first-class tickets to LaGuardia. The relief in his eyes when he saw her coming was worth 1,000 words. In the United Club lounge, he handed her a thick envelope. Contracts, insurance, emergency contacts, everything organized with manic precision. He specified she could leave any time, owed him nothing. During the 2-hour flight to New York, while champagne flowed and lunch was served, Mark told his life without varnish. Childhood in Gary's post-industrial wasteland, father's suicide, mother's breakdown, the obsessive reconstruction, empire built on ruins, golden solitude. Emma listened and saw beyond the billionaire. She saw the orphan who'd never stopped searching for home. New York welcomed them with its aggressive indifference. The suite at the plaza overlooked Central Park, autumn painting the trees gold and crimson. 2 bedrooms, as promised, though from the first night that distance felt unnatural. They walked slowly through Central Park, Mark stopping often, supposedly to admire views but really catching his breath. At Bethesda Fountain, he talked about how he'd built his first Manhattan hotel 6 blocks away, but had never walked in this park until now. That evening, they ate hot dogs from a street vendor, sitting on a bench watching skaters at Rockefeller Center. Mark laughed like Emma had never heard when mustard dripped on his $1,000 shoes. For a moment, death seemed very far away. The second day brought the first serious episode. At MoMA, in front of Van Gogh's Starry Night, Mark forgot where he was for 5 minutes, called Emma by his mother's name. The shame in his eyes when clarity returned was unbearable. They flew to Nashville that afternoon. Mark had never listened to country music, considered it beneath him. But that night at the Bluebird Café, listening to unknown songwriters pour their hearts out, he cried openly. Emma held his hand through the entire show. Later, walking down Broadway past honky-tonks blaring music, slightly drunk on Tennessee whiskey, they finally spoke the words hovering between them since that first morning. Not declarations of love, that seemed too cruel given the timeline, but acknowledgement of connection, of finding each other at the worst and best possible moment. Day 4 began in New Orleans. Mark was visibly weaker, medications increasing, but he insisted on experiencing everything. Beignets at Café du Monde, jazz on Royal Street, a cemetery tour that felt too appropriate. That night in the French Quarter, in a tiny courtyard restaurant, they made love for the first time. It wasn't passion, but recognition. 2 souls finding each other at the moment of parting. Afterwards, in the humid darkness, they finally said the words, "I love you. I know. It's unfair to find you now." Emma convinced him it wasn't unfair, but a gift. Some people live 80 years without feeling what they felt in days. Santa Fe brought desert silence and Georgia O'Keeffe skies. Mark was too weak to hike, but they drove to Ghost Ranch, watched sunset paint the mountains. He made her promise to write their story when it was over, to transform their week into something permanent. Day 6, San Francisco. Mark could barely walk. They took a cab to the Golden Gate Bridge, watched fog roll in like a living thing. At Fisherman's Wharf, he gave her a simple silver necklace with a small pearl. "Not expensive," he said, "just real." That night, the crisis was severe. Mark woke screaming, fighting invisible enemies. Emma held him through it, singing Spanish lullabies her mother had sung. When he became lucid, he begged her to take him home. Not Chicago exactly, but back to the beginning, to Mel's Diner. They flew to Seattle the next morning because Mark insisted on seeing rain, real rain, not through hotel windows. They sat in Pike Place Market watching the fish throwers. Mark in a wheelchair now, beyond pride. The rain came that afternoon, gentle and persistent. Mark tilted his face up, let it wash over him, laughing and crying simultaneously. The flight back to Chicago was torture. Mark had 2 seizures that terrified the crew. Emma sang to him, held him, anchored him to life with her voice and touch. They went straight from O'Hare to Northwestern Memorial. Emma's parents came to visit. Miguel shook his hand, recognizing a warrior. Rosa blessed him and brought homemade pozole. Carlos discussed the Cubs with him, giving him dignity of normal conversation. Mark fought to stay lucid, settling final details with obsessive precision. He'd created the Emma Rodriguez Foundation for Emerging Writers, endowed with $5 million. He'd bought her a condo in Lincoln Park, near the lake. Every detail planned like a general's last battle. The final day, they returned to Mel's diner. Mel opened early just for them. Mark could barely sit up, but he wanted his coffee in that cracked mug one more time. As Emma helped him sip it, he told her he'd finally understood what living meant. 42 years building an empire of empty rooms, then 7 days of real life with her. He made her promise to live for both of them, to write, to love again. Emma protested, but he insisted. She had too much love to bury with him. That afternoon, in the Northwestern hospice room overlooking Lake Michigan, Mark died at 3:47 p.m., while Emma read him Steinbeck, East of Eden, about brothers and love and the choices that define us. His last word was her name. 5 years later, in a bookstore in Lincoln Park, Emma Rodriguez signed copies of her third novel. The first, 7 Days to Live, had become a bestseller. The audience thought it was fiction. Only Emma knew every word was true. That evening in her condo, Emma touched the pearl necklace she never removed and began writing. In her desk drawer, she kept Mark's last letter, read 1,000 times. He asked her not to mourn too long, to transform their love into ink, to live to 90 with beautiful children and books that would touch millions. Someday, far in the future, they'd meet again where time doesn't exist, and love is the only currency. The letter contained a surprise. Every year, on the anniversary of their flight to New York, she would receive a plane ticket to a surprise destination. His way of continuing to travel with her. Emma smiled as snow began falling on Chicago. Mark had been wrong about one thing. She would never fall in love again. Not from loyalty to a ghost, but because she'd learned that true love doesn't die. It transforms into words, stories, living memory. Every morning when she sat to write, Mark was there in every sentence. They'd had 7 days in the real world, but in her books, they had eternity. Her new novel's last paragraph read, "Death is just a comma in a sentence that continues." Love is the exclamation point that makes that sentence unforgettable. And stories are how love continues to breathe in the hearts of those brave enough to believe that 7 days can be worth a lifetime. Hit like if you believe true love transcends time. Comment what you would do with 7 days to live intensely. Share for those who need reminding that every day is precious. Subscribe for more stories that touch the soul. Because in the end, it's not how long we live, but how deeply we love. And some loves of 7 days leave prints that last forever.